Hello, everyone. This is Jeff coming to you with the continuation and the conclusion of Luke chapter 22. So, if you'd like to turn in your Bibles to Luke chapter 22, we're going to start in verse 47 and finish off the chapter. Yay! This is our third week in it. But hey, you know what? It's long and it's 71 verses. I try to keep these videos to about half an hour, más o menos, and we just take our time and get through it the best we can. So we finished off last week talking about Jesus in the Mount of Olives and the lead up to his arrest. We start with his arrest today, but last week we were looking at the lead up. We were looking at the question about Jesus and the sword and all that kind of stuff. Talking about these things. We're going to see the fallout of this today. But something that we need to remember as we go through this. I had a question about this last week. I tried to address it, but again, with one-way teaching, don't know if I got the question answered as well as they wanted or not. But regardless, we need to remember that just because the prophecies of Jesus' crucifixion go back to the beginning of the Old Testament, it does not mean the human element is not present. Now, the question I got last week was about Judas, and the thing was, if the betrayal of Jesus is a prophesied event, did Judas really betray Jesus since Jesus knew it was going to happen? And the answer to that is yes. And the reason is foreknowledge of an event does not mean that a betrayal didn't happen. Okay. And the reason is because Judas didn't know that, Jesus wasn't going to be surprised. And betrayal doesn't have to mean surprise. Betrayal is just a behavior. It's a decision to go against someone that is close to you. And so Judas choosing to sell Jesus up the river for 30 pieces of silver, even though Jesus knew it, it doesn't take away from the fact that Judas still decided to sell Jesus to the mob. Jesus' foreknowledge really doesn't come into this equation at all as far as a betrayal is all about. But this is important as we move forward, and anytime that we study the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Again, so much of Jesus' life was prophesied in the Old Testament, and Jesus came and he fulfilled all of it. But we have to ask ourselves the question, even though the events were prophesied, for example, Jesus being taken by the Jews, taken to trial, taken before Pilate, and nailed to the cross. Do we think that those who carried out the death of Jesus cared that they were fulfilling prophecy? Do we think, when the Pharisees are standing at the foot of Jesus' cross and they're yelling at Jesus, to come down from the cross and we'll believe in you, or that, let's see now if God will save him, and all those that trash talk that they gave Jesus on the cross, that was prophesied back in Psalm 22. Now, do we think that the Jews standing at the foot of Jesus' cross were sitting here saying, okay, this is now when the time comes in which we trash talk Jesus in order to fulfill scripture? Or do we think that when Judas was leading the mob, do we think he was thinking, okay, I'm doing this so that I can fulfill scripture so that Jesus can be betrayed and arrested? Or the fact that Judas got paid 30 pieces of silver. Okay, this is the sum of money that I'm getting for the betrayal of the Savior. This is what I'm asking for. This is what I need. And all that kind of stuff. It is a prophesied event, but we have to understand that even though the event was prophesied, the human element was spontaneous. In other words, the human characters, the human element, the people who were there, they weren't interested in fulfilling prophecy. They were doing what they thought they needed to do. It just turned out that they were fulfilling prophecy. And this is how come Jesus wasn't surprised by any of the stuff that happened to him. He knew it was coming, But the people there involved, they didn't realize they were following prophecy. So hopefully that helps us to, think about some things as we move on. Was it still a betrayal of Jesus, even though Jesus knew Judas was going to betray him? Yes, because Judas chose to betray. The prophecy was that the Messiah was going to be betrayed. It did not give us a name. All right. So people say, well, Judas had to do it. No, Judas didn't really have to do it. It could have been any of them. It's just Judas was the one that chose to do it. And so again, let's not outsmart ourselves into thinking that certain things had to play out the way that they played out, or just because Jesus knew it was coming, it takes away the element of behavior, or takes away the element of choice from everybody else that was surrounding Jesus. Because as we move forward through this, to the point where we get Jesus onto the cross, yeah, Jesus was betrayed. Yes, Jesus was arrested, but Jesus didn't make it easy on anybody, even though it was a prophesied event. In other words, Jesus, with what he says and how he acts and how the people react to him, humanity really shows their dark side when with the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. So let's talk about this, as we move on. So Jesus is betrayed in Luke chapter 22 and verse 47, where he says, while he was still speaking, there came a crowd, and the man called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. He drew near to Jesus to kiss him. But Jesus said to him, Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss? And when those who were around him saw what would follow, they said, Lord, shall we strike with the sword? And one of them struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his right ear. But Jesus said, no more of this. And he touched the ear and healed him. And then Jesus said to the chief priests and officers of the temple and elders who had come out against him, have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs? When I was with you day after day in the temple, you did not lay hands on me, but this is your hour, the power of darkness. Okay, so Judas, he's identified as the man named Judas, or the one called Judas. And he comes and we know people who don't, atheists know, the story of Judas. Okay, so Judas comes leading the mob and he kisses Jesus on the cheek, which is a pure greeting, but it's with this greeting that Judas betrays Jesus. And you say, well, why do this now? Well, again, remember, it's night. Okay, it's night, and even though you got torches, you got the 12 disciples there plus the women. Obviously, you know that Jesus isn't one of the women, but it's a dark place full of shadows. So again, what was Judas's role in all this? Judas's role was to lead the mob to where Jesus was going to be, because Jesus established a pattern of behavior. As soon as he came back to Jerusalem, he was spending the day in the temple area and spending the nights on the Mount of Olives. This was an established pattern. Judas knew where to go. But also, they needed Judas because the reputation of Jesus was far and wide. People knew knew what Jesus did, but how many people knew what Jesus looked like? Again, a modern audience needs to put ourselves back in a period of time where we don't have Facebook, where people don't have cell phones with cameras on it, and so there's pictures of us floating all over the place. We're surrounded by pictures. It's easy to create and to develop pictures, photographs, and things of this nature. And if we want to know what somebody looks like, all we have to do is search them up by name on Google, and it'll give us pictures. What did Jesus look like? And did Jesus look enough by himself? He was a man in his early 30s who was a Jewish male from Galilee. Okay, bravo. Okay, we're talking about a small area, and he looked like probably a lot of other guys. So you needed Judas in order to single out the Messiah. And so with a kiss, with that innocent gesture of greeting, more so in other parts of the world than in America, we just don't go up to people and just kiss them on the cheek and say hi. With that, Judas betrays Jesus. And this is why, as time moves forward, that phrase "kiss of death" or that gets used, and that was actually used in the mob, for example. You would get the kiss of death, which means that you were going to be killed. That this function, this action, the kiss, which is a greeting, familiarity, supposed to be a mark of a close friendship. It's used as an instrument of betrayal. So after that, the 12 ask permission to attack. Because again, remember, we talked about this last week. Jesus tells them, if you don't have a sword, go and buy one. They said, well, here we have two swords, and he says that is enough. Again, people say, well, that's an argument Jesus made for concealed carry. No, it was so that Jesus could be marked as one of the transgressors, the prophecy that comes out of the book of Isaiah. So now here, the disciples know what's about to go down, and they ask for permission to attack. My thoughts about Peter, Peter's denial later on. We'll talk more about this later. It's it's easy to get guys to sell guys on the idea of going out in a blaze of glory. The history books are filled with it. Military history is filled with it. Why is it that guys love movies like Braveheart, Gladiator, Rocky, all these things where they fight that, the Alamo, all these, the 300, these movies in which even if the hero dies or loses, they go down fighting. That's a very male idea. Guys can really back that up. And so, Peter's saying, if it's necessary, I'll even die with you. I have the feeling that when Peter said that, what he was thinking was, it's going to be Jesus and I, or maybe other people in the 12 felt this way too, but it's going to be Jesus and us fighting the Romans and fighting the Jews, going down to the last man. We don't know how many people it's going to take from them to take us all out, but we're going to make them find out how many it's going to take, and all this kind of stuff. Going down in a blaze of glory, fighting to the last man. We got our two swords. Let's now fight the mob. Because remember, that's all they got. And one of them lashes out. We found out in another gospel that Peter lashes out and strikes the servant on the ear. Jesus, at this point, though, he says, no more of this. No. He shuts it down. Now, see, that's the problem with people who try to use this whole sword thing out of Luke to justify concealed carry or fighting off self-defense and all this kind of stuff that they try to use it for, is that when Peter lashes out and actually cuts off a guy's ear, Jesus stops this, heals the man, and allows them to take Jesus away. He stops it. And even though he stops it, he shuts it down. Jesus, though, he still makes this a very uncomfortable arrest. And again, this is what we're talking about earlier. Jesus, again, went along with the plan. It was the plan. If we were going to have salvation, this is what Jesus was going to do. But he was going to take every opportunity he could to make the people think about what they were doing. And so Jesus says to them, have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs? When I was with you day after day in the temple, you did not lay hands on me, but this is your hour in the power of darkness. And so Jesus makes this a very uncomfortable arrest. They surround him, they start shackling him up, and then, and because again, you think about everything that Jesus has done. What has Jesus done in life? Okay, think about it with me. Jesus has performed miracles, he's healed people, he's raised from the dead, he's multiplied food, he's cured leprosy, he's cured paralysis, he's cured the woman with an issue of blood, he's cast out demons. I'm sure there's things I'm forgetting, but we get the point. Jesus has done a lot of good. Okay. How would you go and betray such a man? Or how would you go and arrest such a man? Somebody who has no history of violence. You want to talk about violence of Jesus. Okay. Well, he did trash the temple. Okay, that is one. And he did cause a fig tree to die. Okay, that's another. But did he have a history of violent behavior? No. Did he have a history of fighting off guards or wielding weapons or any of things like this? No. And so, why are they approaching him like they would approach a violent offender? They're coming after him with swords and clubs, a mob of them coming after him with swords and clubs. Why are they doing this when Jesus, throughout his life, has been a person of peace? We talked about the withered fig tree. We talked about Jesus trashing the temple. That's okay. Two events in the span of 3 years of ministry. Did Jesus warrant having a mob, a heavily armed mob, going out and getting him? No. Also, Jesus brings up another point. I was with you day after day in the temple, and you did not lay hands on me. In other words, again, they needed Judas to go out with them into the garden to arrest Jesus by night away from the mob. But the truth is like, you know what? We all know, everybody knows that they could not stand Jesus and they wanted Jesus taken away, arrested, and eventually killed. Jesus' question is, why are you doing this here? Why? I was with you every day. I was with you and you did nothing. So why are you doing this now? Getting them to think about some things. Are they not totally up and up on what they're doing? Jesus says, this is your hour and the power of darkness. He knows that it's the time, but he's still getting them to think about it. And so after Jesus is arrested, the disciples scatter and we start following Peter. In verse 54, it says, then they seized him and led him away, bringing him to the high priest's house. And Peter was following at a distance. And when they kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and sat down together, Peter sat down among them. Then a servant girl, seeing him as he sat in the light and looking closely at him, said, this man also was with him. But he denied it, saying, woman, I do not know him. And a little later, someone else saw him and said, you also are one of them. But Peter said, man, I am not. And after an interval of about an hour, still another insisted, saying, certainly this man also was with him, for he too is a Galilean. But Peter said, man, I do not know what you are talking about. And immediately, while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed, and the Lord turned and looked at Peter. And Peter remembered the saying of the Lord, how he had said to him, before the rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times. And he went out and he wept bitterly. Okay, so what happened to Peter? Now, Peter's the guy that told Jesus, look, if everybody else leaves you, I won't. And even if I have to die with you, I will. And so that was then. And by the time we get to the end of this section, Peter has denied Jesus 3 times, and we won't see him again until after the resurrection of Jesus. So what happened? Did he just lose his nerve? No, it's not about losing nerve. It's going back to what we were talking about earlier. Peter had the idea of going down in a blaze of glory with Jesus, but then he finally understood what the path of Jesus was. Throughout the ministry, off and on, throughout all this, Jesus told him, I'm going to go to Jerusalem. I'm going to be handed over to the chief priests and teachers of the law. They're going to hand me over to the Gentiles. I'm going to be crucified, and on the 3rd day, I will be raised to life. But Jesus also told them, whoever is great among you should be the least. Whoever is going to be the master needs to be the servant. It's not about how high we can go, it's about how low we can go. The ability to submit to God's will, to submit and become less so that God can make us greater. On this night, Peter finally understands some of what that means. And at that time, again, this is before the resurrection, at that time, he did not want anything to do with it. So he's approached by a servant girl. And she says, this man also was with him. He denies it. It says, I do not know him. In other words, the first denial, Peter denies knowing or being with Jesus. A little later, someone else comes to him and says, you also are one of them. But Peter said, man, I am not. In other words, Peter denies being one of the 12. You're one of them. Well, who's them? Jesus and his followers. And Peter says, nope, sure not. Thank you. So a little bit later, some more people come and they say, certainly this man also was with him, for he too is a Galilean. So they're able to trace his accent. They're able, and he looks familiar. And again, Peter says, man, I do not know what you are talking about. So Peter then on this third denial denies having any knowledge of anything. So yeah, it's three denials. It's three different ways in which he denied. But as soon, this is one of those goosebump parts of Luke. But as soon as he says this, the rooster crows, and some way, somehow, Jesus is looking out the window, or Jesus is being carted from one place to the other. But for some reason, Jesus is able to look over, and the eyes of Peter and Jesus lock, and they see each other. And Peter sees the truth. He sees the truth about himself. He sees the truth about his proud boast, and he sees the truth of his failures on this night, having denied Jesus 3 times. And he loses it, and he goes out and he weeps bitterly. Peter on this night, it was an important night for Peter. And Peter's able to boomerang from this night and become, and turn it into a victory. But at this time, Peter saw himself for what he really was, and he didn't like it. Now, all of us need moments like this, and where we're able to look at ourselves unfiltered and see what we really are, and then to grow from it, hopefully. But that's what Peter went through that night. He saw what he really was. He saw that Jesus was right. He saw that he failed, and he thought he was done. He goes off and he weeps bitterly. Sad. Meanwhile, Jesus is taken and mocked. He says in verse 63, now the men who were holding Jesus in custody were mocking him. As they beat him, they also blindfolded him and kept asking him, prophesy, who is it that struck you? And they said many other things against him, blaspheming him. So Jesus is being mocked. He's being ridiculed. He's being abused. And as you read this section, though, and as we move forward, remember that Jesus could have stopped this anytime he wanted to stop it. Luke doesn't go into it, but after Peter cuts off the ear, he tells Peter in Matthew, is like, don't you know that if at my say so, God would send 10 legions of angels to come and rescue me? I don't need you to rescue me. I can stop this anytime I want to. But the power of the crucifixion was not just his dying on the cross, but his decisions that led him to the cross and kept him on the cross. If Jesus retaliated against these soldiers, holding him and abusing him and mocking him and doing all this other stuff to him, where would our salvation be? We wouldn't have it, because Jesus would have said, you know what, that's enough, I'm not doing it. But the fact that he chose to stay does not show Jesus' weakness, that he wasn't able to get out of the situation. It was showing his strength, that he was keeping faith with God's will and wanting to follow the plan that God established so that we could have salvation. That's what Jesus wanted to do. And that's why he stayed. He stayed for the love of us. But after he's abused for a time, he's taken before the council. And it says in verse 66, when the day came, the assembly of the elders of the people gathered together, both chief priests and scribes, and they led him away to their council, and they said, if you are the Christ, tell us. But he said to them, if I tell you, you will not believe, and if I ask you, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man shall be seated on the right hand of the power of God. So they all said, you are the Son of God then. Then he said to them, you say that I am. Then he said, what further testimony do we need? We have heard it ourselves from his own lips. Okay, so he's hauled before the council, and they say, tell us who you are, plainly tell us. However, Jesus wouldn't tell them because they would not believe. Now we see this in Jesus' ministry. And this is a hard lesson for people who try to share the Lord with other people and teach the Bible. And it's that Jesus will not waste time trying to convince people who do not want to hear the truth. Now, he'll work with people who are searching or who are unsure. But if people are totally combative to the cause of Christ or the plan of the Lord, or they just flat out don't want to hear it, Jesus won't tell them. It's like when Jesus healed the man, who was possessed by the demons of Legion. When he sends the demons into the pigs, the pigs run off into the water and they die, and the town comes out, and the person who's healed, he wants to be around Jesus now, but the rest of the town people, they want Jesus to leave. Guess what Jesus does? He leaves. Now, this is a guy who stopped Legion and told demons to go into a bunch of pigs, and the pigs died. What do we think Jesus could have done to the town folk? Well, anything he wanted, but he didn't. Why? Well, A, because it would have been an abuse of his power, but two, they wanted him to go, so he left. Jesus would tell people in the Sermon on the Mount, do not cast your pearls before pigs, do not give dogs what is sacred, because if you do, they'll stomp them under their feet, turn and tear you to pieces. What's the point there? We want to share the gospel with everybody, but if people are just going to be so combative as to not even give ear to what we're talking about, don't waste your time. Instead, go and find other people who will be willing to listen. Jesus had a situation with the Pharisees and the Sadducees, in which they come to him, and after he trashes the temple, they come to him and they say, by what authority do you have the right to do this? And Jesus says, well, you know what? I have a question for you. If you answer my question, I will tell you anything that you want to know. And then he says, John's baptism, is it by God or by man? Tell me. Talk about it amongst themselves. And they think to themselves, well, if we say that the baptism was from God, then he'll say, well, why didn't you believe him? And if we say it was from man, then the people will be mad at us because they believe that John was a prophet. So they look at Jesus and they say, well, we don't know. And Jesus says, neither will you know by what authority I do these things. In other words, there's been several times in which the people, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they want to know who Jesus is. But in order to really understand who Jesus is, we have to kill off our ego and our pride in order to be able to hear those lessons. And these guys, most of them, did not want to kill off their ego and pride. They still think that they're in charge. They still think they're running the show, when in reality, the person who's in charge of this whole trial of Jesus and his later crucifixion is Jesus. And so Jesus says, I could tell you, but you wouldn't believe me. And if I ask you, you will not answer. Ask him what? Who do you think I am? Who else is running around performing miracles and doing everything that Jesus is doing? And by what authority? Gospel of John tells us a wonderful account of a blind man in John 9. This uneducated blind man defending Jesus to the Sanhedrin. If God was not with him, he would not be able to do anything. It's amazing. We can outsmart ourselves from having a relationship with God if we're not careful. If we want to know who Jesus is, we have to be willing to humble ourselves to find out. So they said, are you the Son of God then? And he said, you say that I am. These things that Jesus says, he also says that he's going to be seated at the right hand of power of God. Again, the Jews missed out on him because they didn't really want to know him. Jesus says he's going to be seated and his work's going to be done. We get this out of Hebrews chapter 12, verse 13. It's in that section of Hebrews which compares sacrifices. The Jews have been offering sacrifices for thousands of years by the time you get to the point of Jesus. But the thing is like every time that a priest offers a sacrifice, there was always another one that needed to be sacrificing. Every year when the Day of Atonement would come around, the chief priest would have to offer sacrifice. But lo and behold, next year they had to do it all over again. Yet when Jesus offers his sacrifice on the cross, he finishes, he's done, And when he ascends into heaven, he goes up there and he sits down. Priestly work was not a seating position because there was always something to do. Jesus, however, gets to sit because he is done. You say that I am. Jesus slightly answers one of their questions, but they take this information and run off to Pilate. Why? Because they don't want to know. What further testimony do we need than this? We have heard it for ourselves from his own lips. They took this as an admission of guilt. They took it as Jesus proclaiming the fact that he blasphemed. Again, what did the Jews want? Well, they wanted the power, they wanted the authority, they wanted the prestige of being God's people, but they did not want to humble themselves to fully understand what being God's people really meant. Peter wanted to die with Jesus. I have no trouble believing that at all. Peter wanted to die for Jesus as long as it meant going down in a blaze of glory, surrounded by their enemies, striking them down, fighting back. But to humble oneself to the will of God, to be taken without a struggle away so that he could be killed, Peter didn't want anything to do with that. And so he denied him 3 times. This all comes down, and as we move forward through this, we're talking about submission to God's will. And that's really what the crucifixion of Jesus Christ was. It was God's will for Jesus to be crucified so that we could have salvation. Jesus had to agree with it. Jesus had to go along with it. Jesus had to make it happen. He had the choice to get out of it if he wanted to, but he chose not to. He chose to go through with it. And so that's the great lesson for us today, is that this is just a continuance of submission to the will of God. The conviction of Jesus is not just a fulfillment of prophecy, but it exposes the evil of men and the goodness of Jesus. Well, blessings to you all. Grace and peace to you. We will see you next time.